The story begins at the stone chamber where a man meticulously repeatedly honed a blade while an elderly man sitting on stone clasping his hand for prayer. Nearby, a young boy is restrained on a wooden table while pounding his wrist and trembling as he observes the preparation of the blade. His breathing accelerates as the elderly man approaches with a bowl of thick liquid, commanding him to open his mouth, and the viscous substance is thrust down his throat, causing him to gag and cough as it dribbles down his chin. Despite his struggles, firm hands keep him immobilized, ensuring he ingests every last drop. His stomach clenches and his body quakes as the panic intensifies within him. The man suddenly yanks touch at his feet. The boy thrashes desperately, but the restraints do not budge. His mouth opens in a silent scream as the bearded man lifts the sharp blade high above his head, the metal gleaming under the dim torchlight. Then everything changes. He wakes from painful dream sleeping room headed to library. The boy stood firm in front of the chief librarian, his sharp gaze locked onto the old man as he insisted that the book belonged in the literature section because it was nothing more than a myth, but the librarian remained unshaken as he calmly stated that the emperor himself had declared it historically accurate at the imperial conference last year, which was why it had to stay in the history section. The boy narrowed his eyes, studying the old man's face with suspicion before accusing him of lying because it was clear that he simply found it too troublesome to change the book's classification. The librarian flinched at the remark, his sweat visible as he tried to maintain his composure, but in the end he simply shrugged and stated that the decision had already been made and would not change. The boy sighed as he walked through the grand halls of the Anatolian Empire's National Library, the place where he worked, lived, and spent all his time. He carried a stack of scrolls and books, his routine mostly consisting of organizing them and researching whatever he was told to look into. His ability to read and write in foreign languages had secured him this job, and even though he was a eunuch, he was satisfied with his work. His life before arriving here had been far from easy, but at least now he had a roof over his head, 3 meals a day, and no one hit him with a whip. Most importantly, he had access to every book in the library, allowing him to read as much as he wanted except for the ones that were locked away in the banned section. Later that day, he sat on the floor with a few other boys playing a simple gambling game involving hidden objects beneath cups, his sharp eyes quickly identifying the correct one to the frustration of the others. One of them groaned loudly after losing and demanded to know how he was always able to tell, while another chuckled saying he was glad to have the boys help, but that meant he would be paying tomorrow. The conversation shifted when the boy curiously asked if they knew what kind of books were stored in the banned section, but none of them had an answer because no one was allowed inside. Instead, one of the boys leaned in with a mischievous grin, whispering about a rumor that a ghostly woman appeared in that room in the middle of the night, making the others shudder at the eerie thought. As the conversation continued, they began talking about the city of Anatolia known as the Full Moon Empire and what it was famous for. The boy guessed sweets like baklava and lokum, but his companions laughed, saying he was completely wrong. With sly grins, they revealed that the true answer was beautiful women, and they were heading somewhere that a eunuch like him had no use for, leaving him momentarily speechless at their teasing remark. The boy listened to the others talk about their plans to visit a brothel, but he knew that for someone like him who had lost the ability to reproduce, it would be a pointless experience. Still, he wasn't particularly interested in going anyway as he lay in bed staring at the small pendant in his hand, thinking about what he truly lacked. He gripped it tightly, memories swirling in his mind, while outside the grand city of Anatolia stretched before him, bustling with life, ships docked at the harbor and people moving through the streets. Somewhere in that vast city, a girl was out there wearing the same pendant as his, and he had to find her. He wandered through the market asking if anyone had seen a girl with a pendant like his, but no one could give him an answer. One man even teasingly asked if she was his girlfriend, making him hesitate before quietly admitting that she was his little sister. As he walked through the streets, a woman with a basket caught his eye as she ate something while strolling confidently, her regal appearance standing out among the crowd. Before he could say anything, she suddenly turned to him, grabbing his face with both hands as she stared at him with intense eyes, her voice calm yet filled with curiosity as she called his face unusual, as if she could see something deeper within him. She spoke of blood and gold, hardship and joy, storms and the sun, telling him that she could see many things inside him before suddenly letting go and stepping back. The boy barely had time to react before she pulled her veil over her face and quickly dashed away, leaving him standing there confused as she bid him goodbye and disappeared into the crowd. He sighed watching her go, thinking that fortune-tellers really were a strange bunch, but before he could dwell on it for too long, he turned a corner and his eyes widened at the sight before him. A young woman was struggling against a group of men who had grabbed her, their arrogant smirks showing that they had no intention of letting her go. She was fierce, though her stance strong, as she tried to pull away, but their grip was firm. The boy recognized something about her, but before he could act he noticed their uniforms and the short decorative swords at their waists. They were bodyguards of the emperor, men who held power in this city, which meant no one around them would dare interfere. His heart pounded in his chest as he realized he was no match for them on his own, but he couldn't just stand there and do nothing. His hands clenched into fists as he made a decision, grabbing a rock nearby, knowing he had to do something, but before he could act the girl suddenly used the moment to her advantage, dodging out of their grasp and dashing away, her movements quick and graceful as she disappeared into the crowd. The boy froze, his rock still in hand, as he watched her go before lowering his arm, letting out a small breath of relief as he realized she had managed to escape on her own. The boy peeked from behind the wall, his eyes widening as he saw the emperor's guards sprawled unconscious on the ground, their bodies twisted in awkward positions, groaning in pain while the market bustled around them, completely unaware of what had just happened. He had no idea who could have done this, but whoever it was had taken down trained men with ease and left without a trace. The bystanders murmured in confusion, some whispering about a shaitan, as if a supernatural force had struck them down, but the boy's thoughts were elsewhere, because even after all his searching he had found no clues about the person he was looking for. His mind drifted back to a distant memory, a painful one, of a younger version of himself crawling on the dirt, desperately reaching out as the voices of soldiers surrounded him, his heart pounding as he saw a little girl being dragged away, screaming for him, begging for him not to let them take her away, her voice filled with fear as she cried out his name, but no matter how hard he tried to reach her, his body was weak, his hands clawing at the earth uselessly as he watched her disappear into the hands of strangers. The present came rushing back as he wandered through the grand library at night, the moonlight casting long shadows across the massive bookshelves as he held a lantern in one hand, yawning from exhaustion after the strange events of the day. He had so many unanswered questions, but no real way to find the answers he needed. As he walked, his fingers clenched around his shirt, his mind still filled with the image of his sister's desperate face, when he suddenly noticed something unusual ahead of him. The locked door to the banned books section was ajar, the heavy chains that always secured it now undone, as if someone had broken in without making a sound. He hesitated for a moment, the rumors of a ghost haunting this room flickering in his mind, but he shook his head, telling himself that such things were ridiculous before stepping forward and pushing the door open, the old wood creaking under his touch as the dim lantern light revealed stacks of books covered in dust, each one a forbidden text hidden from the rest of the world. His eyes scanned the shelves, filled with curiosity and unease, but before he could take another step, a voice suddenly greeted him, a smooth, gentle voice that sent a chill down his spine. His breath caught as he turned to see a woman seated among the books, her golden hair cascading around her shoulders as she looked at him with an amused expression, her presence so unexpected that he stumbled backward, gripping his lantern tightly as his heart pounded against his ribs. He had never seen her before, and yet she spoke to him so casually, asking if he was one of the workers here, as if nothing was strange about this situation at all. His mind screamed at him to move, to say something to make sense of what was happening, but before he could react, she stood up and closed the distance between them in an instant, grabbing his hand with a firm but gentle grip, her touch warm and solid as she leaned in closer, her lips curling into a smirk as she declared that she was no ghost, that she was very much real, as she guided his trembling hand to her chest, letting him feel the steady heartbeat beneath her skin, her gaze locked onto his with an intensity that sent shivers down his spine. His heart pounded as he staggered back, his breath coming in shallow gasps while his vision blurred, the strange woman standing before him with an unreadable smile. Something was wrong, his body felt weak, as if something had been drained from him entirely, and her whisper sent a chill down his spine, making him realize he had been caught up in something far beyond his understanding. The next thing he knew, he was back with his friends, their worried faces hovering over him as they asked what had happened. One of them assumed he was just overworked, another muttered that they needed to leave before anyone found them there, but his mind was still spinning from the encounter, his hands gripping his clothes as he struggled to make sense of what had just happened. When they found him, he had been lying on the floor of the banned books room, unconscious, his lantern beside him and the door wide open. His friends explained they had gone looking for him when he never returned from his night rounds, but he couldn't remember how he had ended up like that, no matter how hard he tried to recall his last moments before passing out. Even after leaving that place, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly off. How could a court lady have entered such a restricted area? Everything about her had felt unnatural. The only thing left of her was a faint sweet scent in the air and the lingering sensation of her touch. Something about her words, about her presence, made his stomach twist with unease. The next day, he was blindsided by the news that he was being reassigned. His mind raced with the fear that someone had found out about his visit to the banned books room, but the chief librarian assured him it had nothing to do with that. He wasn't even given a reason, only told that it was a direct order from the Grand Advisor himself, and that realization made his chest tighten even more. He tried to argue and insisted he could work harder, that he had transcriptions left unfinished, but it was useless. Someone else would be taking over his duties, and he had no choice but to pack his things and leave, his frustration growing as he realized how little control he had over his own life. Walking through the halls with his belongings, he sighed, feeling like he could never catch a break. He had liked working in the library, and now it was being taken from him. But as the image of that mysterious woman flashed in his mind again, he realized that maybe this change could bring him closer to the answers he had been looking for all along. Jafar was still trying to understand why he was suddenly reassigned when he was told that his new role would be as a room attendant, but before he could ask more, he was warned that the ladies he would be serving had their own peculiarities, and he would understand once he saw them himself, leaving him with a growing sense of unease as he followed along carrying his belongings. As they approached the massive gate, he was struck by its size, realizing that it was the only entrance separating the outside world from the hidden one within, and that the only man permitted to enter freely was the emperor himself. The realization made him uneasy and even more aware of how different this place was from the library where he had worked before. Walking through the entrance, he listened as his guide explained that eunuchs like them were an exception since they were not considered men. They were allowed to serve in this secluded world, and as he took in his surroundings, he felt a strange mix of detachment and curiosity, as if stepping into a completely different reality. The moment he stepped into the harem, his eyes widened at the sight of women laughing, splashing water at each other, and chatting over delicate treats. The atmosphere was light and filled with an air of luxury unlike anything he had experienced before. His guide pointed toward a specific group and told him those were the ones he would be attending, urging him to introduce himself. As he approached, he caught the scent of something familiar drifting through the air, and his heart pounded when he realized it was the same fragrance from the room of banned books, the scent that lingered from that mysterious woman, and for a moment everything around him blurred as he pieced together the connection. Before he could dwell on it further, a group of curious women turned their attention to him, remarking on how rare it was to see someone like him among the eunuchs, and when they questioned who he was, he quickly introduced himself as the new attendant for the Jade Room, nervously feeling the weight of their stares as whispers spread about how often attendants for that room were replaced. Then his breath caught in his throat as his gaze fell upon a woman reclining elegantly among the others, surrounded by the scent of roses, and with an air of effortless allure. His heartbeat pounded in his ears as their eyes met, and he immediately recognized her. This was the woman from before, the one who had left him dazed and shaken, and now she was before him again, as if fate had drawn him straight to her. As she introduced herself as Elam Rosa, he struggled to keep his composure, realizing in shock that the two other women beside her were also her sisters, the very ones he was meant to serve, and while one of them eyed him with uncertainty, another dismissed him as nothing more than a mere child, leaving him feeling even more out of place in this strange and unfamiliar world. Their second meeting felt almost surreal, as if the moment had been woven into fate itself, and yet beneath the beauty and charm of the scene there was an unshakable mystery lingering in the air, and as his mind reeled, trying to make sense of it all, somewhere in the darkness of the palace a hooded figure moved silently, carrying an unconscious woman in his arms, a shadow creeping ever closer to the secrets buried within these walls. Jafar and the others moved quickly through the harem grounds, realizing just how vast the place was, and though they managed to arrive on time, he couldn't shake the feeling of being overwhelmed by the sheer scale of it all. As he took in his surroundings, he suddenly noticed something unusual, causing him to tense up before turning his attention back to his duties. Inside the bustling kitchen, the air was filled with the sounds of clattering pots and shouting cooks as orders were being thrown around in rapid succession. The kitchen staff worked tirelessly to prepare meals, with the head cook barking out commands, demanding ingredients, and checking on the status of the dishes, while Jafar and the other attendants stood at the ready, waiting for their tasks. Meanwhile, outside in the harem, Lady Demila was as energetic as ever, unable to sit still for even a moment as she swung effortlessly from a wooden pole, flipping and leaping with incredible agility. Despite being reprimanded for her behavior, she remained carefree and playful. Unlike her sisters, she was always moving, and her physical abilities left Jafar wondering just how much she was truly capable of. As he continued his work, he encountered Lady Morche, who as always carried a sleepy and distant air around her. In contrast to Demila's boundless energy, she moved slowly and often uttered cryptic statements that made little sense to those around her, and as Jafar watched her mumbling about sparrows and hawks, he couldn't help but wonder about the meaning behind her words. Later, when he finally made his way to serve breakfast to Lady Morche, he found her still half asleep, groggily responding only when the mention of food was brought up. Despite her constant drowsiness, it was clear that she had a strong love for eating, making Jafar realize that no matter how tired she looked, food would always be enough to rouse her from sleep. Stepping outside, he was once again met with the sight of Lady Elam Rosa, the oldest of the three sisters, also known as the Golden Rose. She carried herself with a regal and captivating presence that set her apart from everyone else, and even among the many beautiful women in the harem, she was the one who stood out the most, effortlessly attracting attention without even trying. As Jafar greeted her, she returned his words with a knowing smile, exuding an air of mystery that made it difficult to tell what she was thinking. She was different from Lady Morche in that way. While one was unpredictable in her cryptic words, the other concealed her thoughts behind an elegant and unreadable mask, making Jafar feel even more uncertain about how he should behave around her. At breakfast, the sisters sat together discussing their usual complaints about the limited meals they were given. While Lady Demila grumbled about eating nothing but dates, Lady Elam Rosa calmly reminded her that the higher one rose in the rankings, the better privileges they would receive, and though her words were meant as simple advice, there was a deeper implication behind them, one that hinted at the harsh reality of life within the harem. As Jafar watched them, he realized that he still hadn't found the right moment to ask Lady Elam Rosa about that night, the night when everything changed, the night that still lingered in his mind no matter how much he tried to push it away. Lady Elam Rosa moved with effortless grace as she dismissed the conversation about vegetables, making it clear that she had no interest in them, and instead turning her attention to Jafar with a subtle smile. As she stretched out languidly on the wooden bench, she requested the usual, and Jafar knew what that meant without needing further explanation. As he stepped closer to begin his task, he couldn't help but notice how completely at ease she was around him, lying there without a care in the world, because to her he wasn't considered a man, and so there was no need for caution. He hesitated for only a moment before placing his hands on her back, feeling her skin smooth and flawless beneath his fingertips as he tried to focus only on his duty rather than the undeniable presence of the woman before him. He struggled to keep his mind blank, trying his best to avoid unnecessary thoughts while working, but the casual banter from Lady Demila and Lady Morche at the nearby table did little to help the situation, with Demila teasingly pointing out how much Elam Rosa loved getting massages from Jafar, while Morche lazily commented on her sister's habit of acting like an old woman despite her beauty and presence. Elam Rosa sighed in response, shifting slightly as she remarked about how her figure gave her constant shoulder pain and how Demila with her smaller frame had it much easier, sparking an immediate reaction from the younger sister, who defensively insisted that she still had a chest and wasn't lacking in that area, which only made Elam Rosa chuckle in amusement. Jafar meanwhile tried to move on from the awkwardness but quickly found himself caught in another moment when he turned to Demila asking about her assigned embroidery work, and without missing a beat, she confidently claimed that she was practically done, though the unimpressed looks from both Jafar and Morche made it obvious that they didn't believe her, and when Jafar called her out on it, she sighed dramatically, wondering aloud how he could always see through her lies, while Morche merely agreed that it was mysterious. Not one to be outdone, Demila decided to change the subject entirely with a mischievous grin as she turned to Jafar and proposed a game, challenging him to guess the color of Morch's underwear before suddenly pouncing on her younger sister, who yelped in protest as chaos erupted. For a brief moment, Elam Rosa simply observed from her seat while Jafar frantically tried to distance himself from the absurd situation, insisting that he had no supernatural ability to read minds or see through things. Amused by his reaction, Elam Rosa let out a small laugh, finding the whole situation interesting. Before shifting the conversation back to something more serious, she casually mentioned her unfinished embroidery but dismissed the importance of it altogether, claiming that someone else would handle it for her before the deadline, and when Jafar warned her that the head court lady would be angry with her again, she merely smirked, unconcerned. Demila wasn't as amused this time, however, as she firmly reminded Elam Rosa that just because she was higher in rank than some of them, it didn't mean she could push all her unwanted tasks onto others. But Elam Rosa remained unfazed, responding with quiet confidence that it was only a matter of time before she ascended even higher in the rankings, and once the Emperor returned, everything would change. She spoke with unwavering certainty as she stretched elegantly on the bench, stating that the moment the Emperor laid eyes on her, he would become utterly captivated by her beauty, and though Jafar wanted to dismiss it as arrogance, he couldn't deny the confidence in her words nor the undeniable presence she carried, and when she mentioned that the Emperor should be returning within a month, it made him pause, wondering how exactly she knew such information. Her explanation was logical enough as she described the current state of the imperial campaign, detailing how the army had surrounded their enemy and was gradually exhausting their resources, but how the larger imperial forces would also struggle to sustain themselves for much longer, making it inevitable that the emperor would soon return to negotiate peace. And though everything she said made sense, Jafar couldn't help but wonder just how she had such insight into the situation. Before he could dwell on it any further, however, Demila suddenly leaned in with a mischievous smirk and called his name in a teasing tone before slyly suggesting that it was about time he let her see something, and the realization of what she meant sent a chill down his spine as she grinned playfully, offering to trade him some dates in exchange for the answer, while Jafar immediately recoiled in horror, frantically refusing as she laughed at his reaction, completely enjoying his discomfort. Jafar found himself in a ridiculous struggle as Morche begged to see what he looked like down there while Demila tackled him from behind, trying to pull his pants down despite his desperate protests as Elam Rosa watched with a sigh, calling Demila hopeless. Demila whispered teasingly in Jafar's ear while he flinched in horror, struggling to break free as Morche cheered her on while a younger girl simply ate unfazed. But just as things got worse, Elam Rosa stepped in, with a sweet yet terrifying smile making Demila freeze in fear. Forced to apologize, Demila pouted while Jafar sighed in exhaustion, but before he could catch a break, a young girl arrived wobbling under a pile of fresh sheets as Jafar quickly helped her, touched by her kindness, thinking she was a good girl unlike the troublemakers he had just dealt with. As the court ladies left for dance lessons, Jafar watched them go, reflecting on how he had been a slave, made a eunuch, and sold to this country, now serving the harem, though he wished he could return to working in the library. But before he could think further, the head eunuch arrived, summoning him to the Byron. Jafar found himself before Sokalu, the first grand advisor, one of the most powerful men in the empire, who questioned him about his work in the harem before remarking on his ability to see through lies, making Jafar wonder if this man was behind his reassignment and why. Sokalu then presented a game, placing an ornate box before Jafar and claiming it was full of jewels, asking him to determine if he was telling the truth, as Jafar realized this was a test and that he was being pulled into something far bigger than he had imagined. Jafar was forced to the ground as the guards restrained him while a blade was drawn beside him, and he was told that if he answered incorrectly he would lose his hands, forcing him to speak before the count of 3 as fear gripped him completely. With no other choice, he shouted that the box was empty, and when Sokalu opened it his answer was proven correct, making Jafar collapse in relief while Sokalu smiled and praised him for doing well even though Jafar knew he had been truly at risk. Sokalu then led him into a dark chamber where an unbearable stench filled the air, and when a coffin was revealed and the cloth was pulled away, Jafar's eyes widened in horror at the sight of a corpse with its entire face peeled off. Sokalu explained that the body's identity was still unknown, but the way it was mutilated suggested something far beyond a simple murder, and as Jafar processed the gruesome scene he realized something terrifying was happening within the palace. Jafar felt his blood run cold as he learned about an ancient method that allowed a person to steal another's identity using dark rituals and human skin, and the horrifying sight of a stretched face confirmed that this was no myth but a gruesome reality. Sokalu revealed that another body had been found and the murders in the harem were not random but part of a sinister plan, while Jafar struggled to grasp the idea that someone was walking around disguised as one of the court women. As they entered a chamber, Jafar was stunned to see Sokalu casually sitting down for a meal right beside a corpse, and he couldn't understand how anyone could remain so composed in such a horrific scene. While eating, Sokalu explained that one victim had been stabbed while another had been poisoned, and the terrifying truth became clear because the murderer had taken the face of their victim and was now hiding in plain sight within the harem. Sokalu continued eating as he explained that with the emperor away and the empress dowager distressed by the recent murders, he had no choice but to take action himself, but with so many women in the harem it was impossible to know exactly who the victim was, since thorough investigations were not allowed unless the situation was extremely dire. He then stated that if there was undeniable evidence the circumstances would change, but that proof had to be found first, and as Jafar processed the overwhelming task before him, Sokalu made it clear that he was the one who would have to uncover the truth. Jafar hesitated, knowing how dangerous it was to pursue an assassin in a place filled with powerful people, but Sokalu offered him an incentive, saying he would search for his lost younger sister if he succeeded, leaving Jafar in shock as he realized how much the Grand Advisor knew about him. Sokalu then nonchalantly remarked that finding a slave girl was an easy task with his authority, and when Jafar asked why he was chosen for this mission, Sokalu explained that it was because he was a eunuch skilled in observation and from an outside land, meaning he could notice things others would overlook. Jafar pointed out that if someone as clever as Sokalu were a eunuch, he could investigate the harem himself and solve the case, which made the guards react aggressively, but Sokalu simply laughed loudly before officially commanding Jafar to find the assassin for the sake of the empire and the emperor. Afterwards, Sokalu pulled Jafar close and warned him that failure would result in grave consequences, implying that another unidentifiable body could easily be added to the growing number of victims, leaving Jafar deeply unsettled as he watched the powerful man walk away. Alone again, Jafar reflected on how ruthless but reasonable Sokalu was and realized that getting into his good graces was worth the risk, since it might be the only chance he had to find his sister. And as the sun set, he remembered the past when he and his sister had fled from their burning town with nothing but the will to survive. He returned to his quarters thinking about how those in power always did as they pleased, and as he stepped inside he was greeted by an energetic voice welcoming him back, reminding him of the chaotic yet familiar world he was now part of. Jafar returned to the harem quarters where the women lounged and was immediately questioned about his absence, but he brushed it off with a casual excuse before a woman with long flowing hair called him away. She led him through the gardens to a place that triggered a memory of their secret meeting, making him realize it had really happened, and she acknowledged that he had kept quiet about it. Smiling, she told him she had a request, and as she snapped a rose from a bush, she asked if he was willing to give everything for her, leaving Jafar stunned by the weight of her words.